first speaker, and I'm just going to introduce him, and we'll let him speak for himself, and then we'll come back and I'll introduce the other folks. I was going to introduce all of them, but for the sake of time, this is James Chisholm, who's CEO of Experiencepoint. He's the co-founder of that company. It's a global simulation design and development company with offices in Toronto and San Francisco, and he flew down here today from Toronto, or last night from Toronto. He's a pioneer in the design of web-based business simulations used by tens of thousands of people already. I think the first one was around 2000. I might be off by a year, but it started around 2000. He authored a chapter in a handbook of experiential learning, and Experiencepoint is well recognized by authorities that you recognize. So I'd like to introduce James Chisholm, and now to talk about simulations. James?
It's 10 a.m. and I'm already causing trouble. Sorry for this, folks. I've got to catch a flight after this. Just going to pull up simulations here.
Okay. You got it. No, you got it. Go ahead. You know what you're doing.
Sometimes I think I do. There we go. Great. So a little bit of Experiencepoint, founded about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago when I was 12 years old. I like to joke. Much younger than I look. We worked with a lot of organizations in that time. A lot of folks on the government side, a lot with the military. We worked with the Navy in Monterey with the admirals, vice admirals. We work with the Air Force. We work with the Marines as well. And primarily the simulations that I'm talking about here are leadership simulations. So these aren't war games. These are helping leaders and managers make better decisions. We work with the United Nations in the Leadership Development Program. A variety of different pharma companies there you see, technology companies, and many of the top business schools in the world. So why all this interest in simulation and gaming, and particularly as it relates to leadership and development? Well, as Jane alluded to earlier today, it's because of everyone in this room today, and that is workforce demographics. We believe that there's this tsunami, as Jane talked about, where all this tacit knowledge that sits up in the heads is going to be lost, potentially to be lost in the next 10 years. So some crazy numbers here. It's phenomenal. When we look at this tsunami, we can actually visualize it here in this graph, and that's the area that's grayed out. And that's what we call the experience gap. So these are the folks who may be leaving, and we've got to close that experience gap. So how do we do this? How do we close this gap? This is one of my favorite quotes, and I didn't pay him to say this. How do you make people capable of doing the job at a dramatically faster rate than simply allowing them to gain experience on the job? The key seems to be business simulations. This is from a couple years ago. And it's interesting, in our business, about, I would say the first 7 or 8 years of our business, it was about going out to folks and convincing them of the merits of simulation-based learning, of putting people into a situation and watching them perform. The last couple of years, it's been a very different conversation. People get it, and they just want something to meet their particular need in their organization. So how can simulations help to bridge this gap? Well, we've got a current level of knowledge or understanding from an individual and a required level. And typically, the understanding is often bestowed. There's a book or a seminar that folks can go to, but the application is at a different level. And how do we get folks from understanding the application? Well, it's through experience and reflection. And this is the particular loop here that simulations can help to accelerate. We look at knowledge, skills, and behavior, and simulation are really in between there. So looking at getting folks into a situation, accelerating the time in which they get to apply this knowledge and to get more capable, more competent. So how do we cut through the hype? Now, when we talk about simulations in games, a lot of folks think about the technology. They think about really what gets the press out there, certainly things like Second Life, 3D characters. It looks really cool. It's kind of sexy. But there is a little bit of hype there. And what we look at is what are the various different learning outcomes. And we classify learning outcomes in terms of 3 broad groups. The first address where and why. So helping people to understand where do we prioritize and why do we do this. Who does what and when, the second category of simulation. And finally, the third category of simulation are how simulations. And if we want to give titles to these, and this will make a lot more sense when I throw these up, the where and why deal with strategy, strategic issues. So if we're playing from a business game point of view or from a war game point of view, it's really understanding how the system operates, understanding how the marketplace operates, and then allowing senior folks to get a sense of where they should prioritize in which direction should we invest. Now, who does what and when is all about execution. We know where we need to go. We've got a vision. Let's execute on it. So let's get those folks together and lined up. There's another great Drucker quote that ties into something that Jane said today about leadership, where Drucker says that leadership is about knowing the right things to do. Very similar to what comes out of the manual. And management is about doing things right. And it's an interesting play on words, knowing the right things to do and doing things right, because knowing the right things to do is really the strategy and execution piece, and doing things right is down in the how space. And most of the e-learning simulations that you've probably been familiar with are down here, the how simulations. The 30-minute, 40-minute decision tree type games where you go in and you can learn something. And I'll show you some examples of that today. The strategy and the execution side, folks don't see. Oh, that's wrong. So the strategy and the execution side, we're seeing more and more e-learning type simulations there, but because these are leadership sims, we typically see these used in a blended model. So leadership is about getting folks together, working together, learning how to, one, set the direction and then influence people towards that direction. And it really requires, from a delivery point of view, people to get together. So elements can be used on the e-learning side, but the learning, training typically takes place at this stage in a workshop simulation format. The how, we're seeing a lot more e-learning in this space right now. I'll go through each of these. So strategy simulations, they teach again where and why. So where do we prioritize and why do we do that? Typical audience are executives and managers, often multiple days, these types of simulations. And the need here is to understand a system or a marketplace. So we need to understand what's going on. Let's identify those leverage points and then select a strategy that's going to allow us to get to that, or to influence that leverage point. The classic strategy simulation game. So this is where I got started. This is a business game from 1991. I'm a bit of a simulation geek because I saved this over all the years. And this is a classic business game. It really hadn't changed much since the 1960s, coming out of Carnegie Tech, one of the most renowned sims. Today, that very same type of simulation can be delivered online. It's a great simulation by Ernie Cadot of Tennessee, and University of Tennessee, and it's called Marketplace Simulation. And again, this is a business type simulation to help people understand markets. Now, from a government policy perspective, I think many folks are probably familiar with system dynamic models, where we model a situation, and then we get to see how all the different variables in that situation relate. This is a phenomenal article that came out last year around modeling jihad. And it's again by two U.S. Air Force gentlemen, and looking at the various different factors at play. Now we can model this and create a game where people play those different characters and get to really understand the influence points in this model. This model here just quickly contains different elements like funding. Where does funding come from? Where does membership grow, etc. So there are these types of sophisticated models that can be custom created for a specific initiative to really understand the policy implications of our decisions. So strategy simulations, again, typically relate for more senior folks making the decision around where are we going to prioritize. Execution is around who does what and when. And this relates really to everybody. Typically can be delivered in a one day. And we're looking at things like change management here, looking at project management as well, and team-based blended, or it can be single user self-directed. The simulation I'm going to show you here is one of our sims that's been used at the Navy. It's been used with the United Nations. And even though it's web-based, 80% of folks still use it in a blended model. And 20% again use it on a single user self-directed model.